journey. So as someone who works with diversity, equity, inclusion, and different company partners, I witness this all the time. Folks are in different places on their DEI journey, and I know it's the same from a pay equity journey standpoint. So when you set out to tackle this pay equity, I'm going to start with Sasha. I'm going to go down the line. So we start with new people every time. Where do you start? When you get started, where are you guys now? And where are you going? What does your roadmap look like when it comes to this journey and how you tackle pay equity?
Yeah, absolutely. It is truly a journey. So I joined Appfire 2 years ago. Prior to that, Appfire had not actually had somebody doing kind of the formal, dedicated HR global role. So when I came in, for the most part, as is I think very often the case in smaller companies or the ones that are kind of earlier in the HR infrastructure journey, a lot of the salary determinations, they were more of like an ad hoc decision. So what's the candidate asking us for? What are they making? And do we feel like that's reasonable? Okay, go for it. And that worked okay for the most part because the company was small. So, there wasn't a lot of internal equity consideration to do because we just had this one person doing this role and one person doing that role. But we are growing really quickly. And so the past 2 years since I've been here, we've about tripled in size just in the 2 years. So obviously compensation was going to be a pretty huge priority for me. So what's the problem with just paying people what they want? Isn't that going to just make everybody happy? Well, maybe, but I'm not going to try to get into the whys of how this happened. 3 minutes is not enough time, but we all know the data, they show that, women, people of color, they tend to ask for less in negotiation. They don't negotiate, they get paid less than men. You've already talked about all this. So the first step is really getting access to market data through those salary surveys. From there, we did the salary ranges. We established our compa ratios for all of the roles. Once we had that framework in place, we took everybody in the company and put them into it and took a look, where are they within those ranges? We did have some outliers. We have some people who were below or above the range for whatever reason. If it's somebody who's below, well, let's bring them up. We need to pay them kind of what the market's showing and make sure that they're all kind of on the same page there. If we have people who are paid higher than the range, why is that? What is it about them or the work that they're doing that we felt like merited that additional pay? Maybe they've kind of outgrown that role and they're really supposed to be in a higher role, but let's figure it out. So that's doing some of that right sizing. That's an ongoing thing. And I think we're going to continue doing these audits to see where people are and make sure that they're appropriate to what the work is that they're doing. And long term, I think the other thing too that we want to make sure that we look at, it's the kind of controlled wage gap versus the uncontrolled wage gap. So we've talked about controlled wage gap. What is the work that the person is doing, and are they paid for that work? But then we need to look at who is in what types of roles. You look at your leadership levels. Do we have women? Do we have people of color? Or is it all white men in these roles? Likewise, for some of our more technical, the coding and things like that, are there as many people of color, as many women in those roles, or is it, again, just kind of the white men in those roles? And are there barriers to minorities entering into these kind of higher compensation types of roles, or are most of the women stuck in the lower earning roles? And how do we make sure that we're attracting people into those higher roles and eliminating those barriers? So that's very much the ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. And that's key to our second takeaway, explaining how this dovetails into DEI efforts. You're absolutely right. It's deeper than pay equity, and it's also interrelated. But I think you bring up some fair points, because everything you named is really what we look at from a DEI standpoint, and pay equity is just part of that conversation. Jennifer, I'd love to hear from you about Asana and where did you start, and where are you now, and where are you going?
Sure. So, we started similar to Sasha. I think the place you start is having the foundation for decision making and making sure that you have those ranges that are going to prevent pay inequities in the first place. And we really started there, and then we started looking at metrics on when pay cycles happen. So start to look at metrics around who is getting equity grants, who's getting pay increases and at what rates, how does that vary between genders and races and ethnicities. This past year, we've sort of moved to more of the gold standard for pay equity analysis, which is to do a deep regression analysis where you're controlling for legitimate factors that could explain differences in pay, and then looking to see what the pay gap is. So what we call the all else equal pay gap. That takes, sort of a sizable population. We tried to do this earlier when we were around, I think, 300 people before I joined the company, and the results were okay, but they weren't really robust enough, I think, to kind of give a lot of confidence in the results. Now that we're, more around 1,000 people, it's a much more robust analysis. We are able to kind of look at those numbers and really trust them for understanding systemic bias based on different groups. I think the next part of the journey is to look at, more types of information. So right now we're looking at our analysis based on gender globally, and then we're looking at race and ethnicity in the US. In the future, we might look at other types of historically disadvantaged groups. Maybe we would be analyzing based on age or disability. And we'll also be kind of looking at things that sort of can be drivers of pay differences, beyond that are not explained by this data. So for example, we're starting to look, we've been looking, but the more we grow, the better the data is that we get around things like promotion decisions and where people are landing kind of within the pay range, because we don't have ratings, but it's something sort of similar, how the guidance that we use for kind of how people are positioned within range. So that's sort of the next phase, is to kind of go deeper and look at more information. For us, we feel it's really critical that we're doing this on a regular basis. So we're doing these pay equity analyses 2 times a year when we do our pay, when we actually do our pay increases, and they're part of the cycle. So the cycle does not get finalized until we actually run all the recommendations and numbers through the analysis and make sure that nothing is coming out with red flags. So that's something that I feel really confident about and comfortable with, especially because we are in such a dynamic environment right now. And to Cassius's point earlier around like the fact that when you're changing bands or you're keeping up with market, and then you might have employees that historically are their pay may be depressed, like it's really important that we kind of keep up with this on a regular basis and make changes quickly and address problems.
Yes, absolutely. 2 times a year is great. So I'm so happy to hear that. The consistency, I think, is great. Consistent review. And Cassius, what about you all? What are you guys doing at Surveymonkey?
Yeah, it's I think about the journey we're on, right? And I started at Surveymonkey just 9 months ago, and I started with a phenomenally committed leadership team. Like that was just a tremendous start. It's been off the charts in terms of the absolute sincerity about diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity. And it showed up from the first, and I'm talking about my own experience because it now translates that I'm on the other side of the table from candidates and new hires. It showed up in how I was interviewed, right? I had an interview with the CEO, with board members, with other leaders. And there was a response to me negotiating my own offer, right? And I was like, oh, pay equity is great, but this is more equity than I wanted to see. Like, what about me? Like, my own deal. And right, they had responses about equity, right? Which was great. So jokes aside, it was clear where new hires fit relative to others in similar roles. It was clear that that was already a focus. And so for us, when I think about the roadmap, I think of 6 elements of it. It's, you need a committed leadership to make a case for a change. And in my case, there was no change. I sort of came into a certain philosophical mindset, and I'm putting lots of legs under it now. The second thing you need is ambitious goals, right? Where do we want to be? And that should have some stretch and ambition to it, right? The world we want to create, and in our organization and organizations, when I think about the types of companies participating in this call, there's ambition there, right, to create a certain future. Then you want sort of the more concreteness, data, metrics, solid plans, and then maybe not as concrete, but really important, candid dialogue people willing to talk about what they see, talk about what their concerns are, have that great dialogue. Then you want to observe progress is kind of the fourth step to me. With that progress, start to gain momentum and then sustain the results, right? That's the journey. And so if that's the journey, and I came in with a groundwork already done for the first few steps in terms of ambitious goals and committed leadership, what I've been doing is more about the ingredients to turbocharge this effort, right? So from this bedrock, I've been able to push on metrics and tactics and possibilities in driving representation and compensation outcomes. For me, and I think it was said earlier, we're not separating representation and compensation, right? So if there are gaps in compensation, and maybe a term to define sort of pay equity, true pay equity takes into account some of the analytics around equal pay for equal work, that people are aligned. But what about non-equal work, right? Representation means the work is equal, right? People have equal access and opportunity to do certain jobs at certain levels and have certain titles. And so representation and compensation outcomes are the true thing, the ultimate thing we're trying to drive. And that's taking some pushing and some ambition to get there. The pay equity part, the analytics about equal pay for equal work, is to us table stakes. It's like, yes, check, we do that. Of course we do that. That would be it would be highly problematic not to do that, right? It would be so against who we are. It would be, you could say, against the law even, right, to not do that. So we're really pushing for true economic and job opportunity outcomes.
Yeah, yeah.